Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 41 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin. Gavin, how you doing, buddy?
I'm pretty good. I'm still, out here living this California lifestyle.
I was going to say, I'm recording over here. It's, 10:34 my
hmm
time right now. What time is it for you?
It is 7:34.
Man, is the sun still up over there?
No, it's not. At
Really?
least,
Okay.
well, my maybe a little. The sky's still a little light, but not really.
Okay. All right. Even still, it's just like time differences, man. It's one of those things, I totally understand it, but it's still nuts that it happens.
What is time anyway?
That brings us to today's episode. What is time? No.
Absolutely not. Actually, we've already sort of talked about that in our episode about the geologic timescale and how that works.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can go back and listen to that one. But for this episode, we got
I need to get better at like remembering what episode is what, because we keep referring back to previous episodes and I never remember what episode's what to send people to. I need to do better at that.
I think we need to hire an intern and have them do that work for
Ooh,
us.
that's a thought.
So if anybody out there is listening and would like to just kind of like remember what episodes we've already done, let us know.
Yeah, literally just like sit in silence until we're like, "Hey, Dave, what episode was that?"
And we're not going to pay it because we
No,
have made
because
zero
we do
dollars.
not get paid.
No, in fact, we have lost money on this podcast, as it turns out.
Which
But even
it
yeah,
is what it is.
I'm fine
In
with.
the service
Oh,
of science.
if there was a better way for me to spend an hour and a half once a week than talking with you, Gavin, I'm not sure what it is, but I am plenty happy to do that. So before we get to the real topic of today's episode, I understand you have a calendar entry for us.
I do, and it's kind of a dud. I'm not gonna lie. So it's a weekend. So it's a weekend. It would be this coming weekend. So you have two chances to get it right. So do you have a year for me?
I mean, I think the one I guessed right was 2016, and then last week was also 2016 when I guessed wrong. So I'm gonna go
Yep.
2016.
Sadly, no, but very close.
Is it 2015?
So the first one of the two, because it is a weekend, is from 2018, and the second one is 2017.
Oh, okay. All right.
So the first one
That's
is
more recent than
definitely
they've been.
yeah. This first one is not really in our wheelhouse, so bear with me. But the second one I picked is because it's in our wheelhouse a bit, and also it's just fun. Um, so this is from September 25th, 2018. And the headline is Liquid Metal Purifies Drinking Water.
Ooh, okay. This is
Sure.
this is good news.
So materials researchers they don't spread out what this means, but I'm presumably it means University of New South Wales, Sydney, uh, announced the development of a type of water purification process that they say relies heavily on nanofilters fashioned from aluminum oxide. Developers say that the filters could also cleanse toxic metals from drinking water while using almost zero energy.
Hmm.
Aluminum oxide is an
I mean,
extremely common mineral whose name I'm forgetting.
this
Um,
seems like really good news.
yeah, I think I'd like to see a little more on it because obviously it wouldn't filter out pathogens like bacteria or things like that. It would just be
Hmm.
like heavy metals, but that'd obviously be great for you know filtering like lead. If this would work for lead, that would be like amazing. Um,
Yeah, anything that we can do to make it, cheaper and easier to drink clean water,
yeah, for sure.
that is a plus in my book.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't really have much commentary on this one because I don't understand much about it. But this next one from 2017, September 26th, 2017, the headline is Bernie Sanders spider discovered.
This is significantly more your wheelhouse than
Yes,
anything
it is.
else, but go ahead.
Yes, it is. Just because I love when there are animals. You can make an argument that it's not the best science being done, but animals named after people because sometimes they give the craziest explanations. I don't think they actually give a real explanation here, but I have an anecdote for one that I'll mention afterward. So,
Please do.
biologists from the University of Vermont Makes sense. Announced the discovery and subsequent naming of 15 new species of, quote, smiley-faced spiders. I don't know. Presumably that is probably a family of spiders. I don't know what
Okay.
it is. Located primarily on Caribbean islands, the spiders have been named in honor of notable figures such as Bernie Sanders, Barack Obama, David Attenborough, and more.
Now these are, correct me if I'm wrong, are these like just like, hey, we named this individual spider, or did they name like a new species?
That would be a species. So it would be,
Wow, okay.
presumably, for the one named after Bernie, it would probably be whatever the genus is, and then the species would probably be Sandersi, if I had to guess.
Okay.
But the anecdote that I said, there is a species of, I, I'm not quite sure exactly what it is. I remember reading about it quite a while ago, but I believe that it is a non-mammalian synapsid. So that would be not mammals, but the things that mammals evolved from. Uh, Named Obamadon, which means Obama's teeth. And the quote that they gave for that was, obviously its teeth don't look anything like a human's teeth, but after he was president at the time, after his famous smile. There's also, in my opinion, one of the best names of a genus of an extinct animal, or really any animal. There's a species of turtle called
Uh-huh.
Ningemis, which means
Like
ninja
after,
turtle.
I love it. I remember
And
reading a number of years ago, there was
mhm,
some, I don't remember what on earth the species was, but there was some like water creature that was named after SpongeBob. And it's like, you know what?
yes, there
Go
is.
for it. Like, like marketing is a part of all of this. And you know what? Let's get some headlines and hopefully some people get interested in the field.
Well, like for some things, it depends. If it's like the new member of like an entire group, where it's like we don't have anything similar to this, I think the name should probably be more descriptive.
I
Um,
I agree, absolutely.
but it's like, at least with the Obama Don one, there was like a reason for it, because this animal had like very prominent teeth. Um,
Hmm.
Whereas the Ninjamis, I believe in the paper, they actually said, because when you name a new genus or species, you need to provide a reason, or at least an explanation. It doesn't have to be a good one, but I believe the direct quote from the paper is, "After that fearsome foursome," meaning the Ninja Turtles. And so, in that sense, as funny as it is, and as happy as it makes me, not the best science being done, but I don't control who names what. So,
But people are having a good time.
yes. With that, let's move on to the main topic of our episode, which
Yeah, speaking of good
is
times.
plesiosaurs. So, if you listen to the last episode, we talked about them quite a lot, in that this is what most people who are interested in cryptozoology, which was the topic of last episode, I didn't mention that, but last episode about cryptozoology, a lot of cryptozoologists who are interested in the Loch Ness Monster think that it might be some kind of, population, or maybe even just single individual of plesiosaur that has somehow managed to survive, since they went extinct. Spoilers, they're not around anymore, but we'll get to that throughout this episode. Uh, but yeah, so everybody knows what this group of animals is, even if you saw one and wouldn't be able to name it. You would see it and be like, "Oh, that," because everybody has in their mind the Loch Ness monster, which, for reasons that
Yes.
we talked about last episode and I'll talk about again, we is not really correct anymore. But they're a really fascinating group of animals, just in my opinion, because they are what we call secondarily aquatic, meaning that they went back to the water. So they are tetrapods, like you, me, uh, elephants. Basically, every vertebrate that lives on land is a tetrapod, meaning that it's got four limbs, or at least it used to. In the case of things like snakes, they used to have four limbs, and all tetrapods, or I should say all amniotes, which means that they lay a shelled egg, or their ancestors did, lives on land. Plesiosaurs, along with many other groups like whales, like sea turtles, although they're not fully aquatic because they come on land to lay eggs, um, are secondarily aquatic. So they went back to the water and live in the water basically full time. Plesiosaurs are just like that. And they have a lot of weird adaptations because they did it in ways that are really weird that like no other group did, which makes them just really weird and funky to think about in regards to the fossil record.
So we're talking about a group of animals that are currently extinct that we
Yes.
know are secondarily aquatic. We know that their ancestors, were on land, and of course, before land, those ancestors were in the water.
As fish, yeah.
Wow. Okay. All right.
Well, they,
So
they evolved from fish just the same as we did.
right, exactly. Right, as all species did on Earth.
Well,
All
not
right.
not necessarily.
Oh,
All
really?
vertebrates. Whereas things like
All right.
crabs, crabs weren't fish.
Fair enough.
Insects weren't
Uh,
fish, things like that. But
yeah, yeah. Plants, bacteria. Yeah. Okay. I see what you're going for there.
yeah.
All right. Well, in that case, let's get started.
So just sort of a basic description of what a plesiosaur is, because like I said, everybody has sort of a vision. So I want to make sure that we're all on the same page talking about the same thing here. So these are very sort of classically, and I don't even think this is something that I heard many times while learning about these animals, but I don't believe we actually know who this quote is from. But they're very classically referred to as a snake threaded through a sea turtle.
A snake thread. I'm not gonna
Be-
lie, having a hard time putting that one in my head.
So their body is very sea turtle like, where they have four flippers, a relatively short tail, and their body is very oval shaped, and it's also very sort of ventrodorsally compressed, or stomach to back compressed. Um, so if you were to look at everything from like the shoulders back, it would look eerily similar, not the same, but eerily similar to a sea turtle. However,
Okay.
the version of plesiosaurs that most people think of then has a super long neck coming out of it that is as long or longer as the rest of the body.
I mean, I've definitely got Loch Ness monster on my brain now, and that's sort of what
Exactly.
I'm thinking of.
Exactly. Um, However, those were not the only kind. So we'll talk about the body first, and then we'll sort of move to the neck. They were typically really large bodied. Obviously, there were some that were relatively small, as small as a couple of feet, but their bodies were very sort of barrel shaped, and their ribs are quite flat, almost. They don't like connect to each other like a turtle, or even like some like the leatherback sea turtle. It doesn't have a full complete shell; it just has its ribs are very very expanded. It used to have a full
Hmm.
shell in its turtley ancestors, but it since lost some of that. But so they have very flat ribs, making their chest very very robust and very like sort of barrel shaped. Their flippers are really interesting because so imagine sort of a sea turtle flipper, right? At least the front flippers. Similar to that, except longer, and they also don't have the restraint of being inside the shell because they don't have a shell.
Hmm.
So they have all the same arms or bones in their arms that you do. They have their humerus, your upper arm bone, your radius and your ulna, your forearm, then all the wrist bones and the finger bones. However, they sort of take it to the extreme in that some animals like whales and things like that that use their flippers mostly for steering. They just make the bones rather long.
Okay.
Plesiosaurs instead just went copy paste, copy paste, copy paste, and they had just have a bunch of relatively small finger bones. So much that I saw quoted that in some species there can be up to 18 bones in a single finger.
Wow. Okay. So instead of Like, is there a particular advantage of having a bunch of small ones versus one long one, or vice versa?
I don't think so. I think it just the way that their genetics worked out.
Mm-hmm.
There was some mutation that gave, one of them some extra bones while they were, developing their flippers, and that one had more babies, and then thousands and millions of years down the line, that just got repeated over and over.
Okay.
Uh, but yeah, considering that we have at most 3 in our fingers, they had
Yeah,
18, so they had just extremely long fingers. However, they were all very much tied together. Not like literally
that
tied
was gonna be my
together,
next
but
question.
they were in a single paddle. So it's not like they had like webbed fingers that were super long. They were not fused, but held together very firmly by like ligaments and tendons and different soft tissues to form like a single
That's
paddle.
that was my next question. Was did they have like extra dexterity or anything like that? But it sounds like the answer is no.
No, it was very rigid,
Okay.
as it would want to be for being an oar, because these are unique among basically every other group of secondarily aquatic animals, with the exception of sea turtles, in that they move with their limbs primarily and not their tail. Because if you think of whales, they their propulsion comes from their tail and they steer with their flippers. Mosasaurs, another extinct reptile group, they propel with the tail and steer with the fins. Uh, Sea turtles do it the most similar, where they propel with their front limbs and steer with the back ones. We're sort of not sure what these guys were doing other than propelling with the limbs, because unlike sea turtles, where the front fins or paddles or flippers or whatever you want to call them are much bigger than the back ones, in plesiosaurs, they're basically the same. The front limbs and the back limbs are just these big sort of diamond shaped, almost like an elongated diamond paddle sticking off of a barrel body.
Mm-hmm.
And so that brings up a lot of questions about, okay, how were you like doing anything? Because with things like mosasaurs, it's like, okay, whales aren't a perfect analog, uh, but at least generally sort of similar body proportions. That's a very rough estimation, but we have things that do vaguely similar things. We have nothing even close to doing what these weirdos were doing. Uh, so that's pretty much the body. They had some really interesting things, obviously, when it comes to their head and their neck, because not all of them had the long, snaky neck with like the relatively small head at the end. The sort of two extremes that are talked about a lot are that form, very long, snaky neck, relatively small head on the end with very sharp teeth. And then there are some that had a very, very short neck and then a just absolutely gigantic head. For
So there's
example,
so
oh, go
a
ahead.
bunch of different sizes,
Not even necessarily sizes. So,
different shapes.
yes, they did come in a lot of sizes. They could be as short as a couple of feet, up to the longest ones being a little over 50 feet. But the body size of a lot of like the biggest ones were about the same. It's just that the ones with the giant head, it's really hard to have a giant head if you have it on the end of like a string, you know. So they just had this really
Mm-hmm.
short neck to make up for that. But when I mean gigantic heads, we'll talk about it more later. But like some of them, like over 5 or 6 feet, potentially up to like close to 10 feet long, just the head.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. So we'll talk
I
about it in a bit. But a fun thing that I have in my notes here. Um, they, if you remember seeing, if you're of partially like the early internet, Charlie the Unicorn.
I showed that to some of my students when we had some free
Why?
time. Because I was a long term substitute and I was not
Oh,
permanently
right.
there. It was
Okay.
right before Christmas. We had finished our lesson, and I was like, you know what?
Gotcha.
It's time for you guys to become cultured.
Yes. So you know how come upon the Liopleurodon.
Liopleurodon.
It's a
Yes, the
Liopleurodon, Charlie. So Liopleurodon is a plesiosaur.
Yes, it is.
Yes, it is. So it's got the barrel body. It's got the 4 big flippers. It is one of the large-headed varieties, which we'll break down a bit more in a bit when we talk about their diversity. But this is
Gavin, I
just the
love you
general
so
structure
much.
of animals. Oh, I couldn't not talk about Charlie the Unicorn in this episode. Who do you think I am? If you have not seen it, we'll do our best to put a link in the show notes. It's
Oh,
worth a watch.
absolutely.
It's extremely cringe, but keep in mind it was like 2010 YouTube humor.
Oh, earlier than that. I was in 6th grade. This is like 2005
Oh
or
wow.
6.
Yeah,
YouTube.
so internet, you're getting some real internet culture here if you are on the younger side. But yeah, Charlie the Unicorn, excellent, high cinema. Anyway, so the last
back to the
bit,
science.
yeah, the last bit that I want to talk about with sort of their body is their tail, because they, like I said, are weird in that they don't really use their tail much, if at all. And there's been some speculation that it might have had some kind of fin on the end of it. Not a big one, and it wouldn't really be used for much more than like an extra rudder. But we apparently the single specimen where there's been like good evidence of there being an actual tail fin on got painted over because it was like the early 1800s, sometime between like 1820 and 1840.
Wait. Evidence of what got painted over?
The presence of a tail fin, so like an impression in the rock around the tail bones.
And it just got painted.
They painted over it, yes. Because for a very long time, we did not do things correctly in paleontology, particularly when it came to
You don't say.
Housing things correctly. For example, the museum that I worked at in South Dakota, and like now we have like some like signage up being like, hey, this is how we used to do things, this is why it's wrong. But all of our skeletons that we have mounted up, like the big ones, we actually have a really large Plesiosaur called Stixxosaurus, the kind with like the very, very long neck that we'll talk about later. But the bones are painted over. They're painted almost black. And that is just really bad because, you can no longer access the surface of that bone really to get any kind of chemical information from it, which is really where a lot of like the new groundbreaking stuff in paleontology is coming from, is from some of these like chemical analyses of bones. And that's just not available on these skeletons anymore, sadly.
I got nothing to say other than, yeah, this sounds familiar from like the Bone Wars and everything. Just there was some poor science being done.
Absolutely. So that's sort of the general description of these things. So one of the big questions whenever there's a real weirdo in the fossil record is like, okay, who is your family? Who raised you to be so weird? So as I mentioned, these are reptiles. And by that I mean, because we like to have good definitions for reptile here on this podcast. By that I mean they are a diapsid, meaning that they are a vertebrate, so something with bones on the inside of their body. An amniote, something that lays an egg with a shell around it. And a diapsid, meaning that they have 2 holes in the back of their skull for muscle attachments, whereas mammals and their ancestors only have 1. So that is what I mean here by reptile. Within reptiles, so other than them being a reptile, we don't really know where these guys fit. They are sort of similar to turtles in that they've sort of popped up on every branch of the reptile family tree that they possibly could throughout different analyses. So some people have suggested that they're somewhat closely related to turtles, mostly because of some of the rib and like central skeleton, vertebrae type features. Although that's also pretty highly speculated just because turtles are also so weird, so you can only get so much information from them. Some people have said that they're on the reptile and snake side of the reptile family tree. Other people say they're on a completely separate branch from any other reptiles, so they're not really that close related to turtles or lizards and snakes
It,
or
it
dinosaurs
sounds
and
like they're weird
crocodiles.
enough where they might just require their own branch.
Right, but then it's like, okay, but then where do you put that branch, right? So it's like,
Yeah,
who
fair
are
enough.
your closest relatives?
Okay.
And that answer, the most of the evidence that I've seen does suggest turtles, but I've also seen some other evidence that more closely suggests like the lizards and snakes. Nobody really puts them with dinosaurs, which is confusing to a lot of people because they just assume, oh, it's a marine reptile that was around at the same time as the dinosaurs. Um, so it must be a dinosaur. But no, that's definitely not where I saw almost no like significant suggestions that they're on the same branches as dinosaurs. Um, but they do have a really interesting origin of their name, which is something that I really enjoy etymology. You know, the study of words, I believe, is what that actually translates to.
Like words and
Um,
names, yeah.
yeah, so plesiosaur means near lizard or close to lizard. And so
Hmm.
uh, that was not really properly descriptive in isolation because it's like if it's like okay I believe the actual most proper translation is closer to lizards, but it's like okay, closer than what? And that's
Do
because
we have a reference point?
we do, because
Oh.
ichthyosaurs, which is another group of extinct marine reptiles from around the same time, maybe a little bit before plesiosaurs. That word ichthyosaur means fish lizard, and they were the first like of the major secondarily aquatic marine reptiles to really take off. There were other ones before them, but they were the first like one to like do super well.
Mm-hmm.
And they went back to looking a lot like fish. So that's where they get their name. And plesiosaurs were named closer to lizards because they looked more like lizards than ichthyosaurs do. So
Hmm.
a little interesting etymology there. But
Yeah, absolutely.
so that's sort of their relation to other reptile groups. So let's talk about some of their relationships within the group itself. So the group itself is Plesiosauria,
Okay.
and in general, it was always sort of thought that there were two main subgroups within this. The true Plesiosaurs, which are the more traditional long snaky neck, small head, and then the Pliosaurs, which are the short neck, real giant heads. Uh, and so they were put into two different families: the Plesiosauridae and the Pliosauridae. However, we used to think that all of the long necked ones were in one group, and then that the short necked, big headed ones branched off of that just a single time and were in their own complete separate group that like branched off of the other group. We now know that that's
So we don't
not
think that
really
anymore.
true. No. So that there
Okay.
are groups that are closely related that have long necked members, have short necked members, have medium necked members, and everywhere in between. So it's like that's not the best way to separate them from a scientific standpoint. However, in just sort of talking about them, most people will sort of define or very early, like in their paper, hey, when I say plesiosaur, I realize that this is not like a proper, like actual, family tree group to put them in. But
Mm-hmm.
when I say this, I'm referring to the morphology, the shape of the ones having the long neck and small head, and vice versa for the pliosaurs, the short necked, big headed ones. So they're mostly used colloquially and not as a real scientific term anymore in that sense. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so if I say that, that is what I mean. Just if I say pliosaur, big crocodile esque head on a relatively short neck, and then the big barrel body with the fins. So
Understood.
that is pretty much their evolution. And like I would try to go into a little bit more about or their relatedness. I would try to go into some of the subgroups within, but their taxonomy, meaning which groups are more closely related to which groups, which other groups, is really bad. um, which makes sense when there's so much, going back and forth between having the long neck and the short neck and the big head and little head, because that they would sort of, through time, the same lineage would go, long neck and small head. They'd shrink the neck and increase the head size a little bit. Then something else would happen, in the environment, and that same lineage would go back to having a long neck. So it's like those are most closely related to each other, but they're just so different and share a lot of traits that overlap with other groups that might not be as closely related, which makes trying to figure out who is cousins with who and who's second cousins with who, it makes that really hard. So I'm not going anywhere near that, but just know that there are some very smart people working on that, and I wish them the best of luck.
And if any of you would like to come on the show to discuss your work,
yes,
I know
absolutely.
a podcast for you.
Absolutely. So, with that, how did we get these real weirdos? Let's talk about their evolution for a bit. So, where did these guys come from? And weirdly, they come from a group that we don't know where the first members came from, but once we have the first members, we actually understand how they got to the plesiosaur shape quite well, weirdly. So it's
we
similar to
understand
turtles.
everything except step 0.
Yeah, pretty much. So it's like with turtles, we understand turtle evolution really well, except where the first one came from. So the first members of their group, so the larger group, sort of how synapsids include mammals, but lots of other stuff as well. The group that includes plesiosaurs and lots of other stuff is called Sauropterygia, which means lizard flipper. They're very descriptive back in the day.
Apparently.
So this group shows up around 247 million years ago in the Triassic period. And again, we're not really sure where these came from. There's a couple of ideas, but we already talked about it. Moving on. We see this group quickly diversify into 3 sort of main groups. The first one is called the Placidots. Really interesting in that they look very turtley, but not in like a turtle way. Like they have a shell, but it's very flat, pancakey, and sort of flares out at the side between their arms and legs. Very strange. Some of them were like that. Some of them were less shell, restricted. Like the more ancestral ones didn't quite have a shell like that yet. They don't make it out of the Triassic, though. They go extinct at the end of the Triassic period. But they don't. Yeah. Well, we'll talk about that in a minute.
Will we?
But but turtles don't show up until I think sometime in the Jurassic or Cretaceous. Probably Jurassic. I don't know that for sure though. So we know that they're not ancestors of turtles. At least the Placidons themselves are not. They might share a common ancestor sometime before this, but we know that at least the Placidons, despite being very turtly, are not turtles. The other group, or one of the other groups, are called the Nothosaurs. And okay, this is going to be a really deep cut, but I know we've talked about Spy Kids 2 on the podcast before.
Yes. Oh yeah, we mentioned that at the end of our the movie Dinosaur, that episode.
We did. I couldn't remember when, but I know we did. So Spy Kids 2, if you've not seen it, features the main characters going to this island where Steve Buscemi is this mad scientist who creates like hybrid creatures. And one of them is like a snake lizard, essentially. Long snake neck.
Yes.
But on like a pretty like squat lizard body. That is essentially what the Nothosaurs are. They still have fully functioning, land-dwelling legs. But they have these long, much stiffer than like a snake. So it wouldn't be able to like, move all that much. It'd be able to move side to side quite well, not as much up and down. But Yeah, but still quite land-based. They might have we find them a lot in coastal environments. So probably, went into the water a bit, but we're not all that aquatically adapted.
Right.
And then we have the Plesiosauria. The animals that we've been talking about this entire thing, who had, or I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. We have the Pistosauria, who had legs. Oh, Mike, had legs much more adapted for swimming. Their joints were stiffer, which is what you want for paddles. If you ever tried rowing a boat with like a floppy oar, it wouldn't work
Or a
very
pool
well.
noodle.
Yeah, that's a really good example. If you tried rowing a canoe with a pool noodle, you would not get very far. So they had much stiffer legs, but probably still spent a decent amount of time on land. And they look generally like plesiosaurs, but with just sort of less exaggerated features. So their legs were not as flippery, their necks were not as sort of extreme, their body was not quite as like barrel shaped. But still most of the plesiosaur features just not as strong, especially the limb girdles. So that would be
What's a limb girdle?
I'm going to explain. That's the general term
I love
for
that name.
your limbs and then the bones most closely associated with them. So in you, that would be, for example, your arm, your shoulder blade, your clavicle, so your collarbone, and then a couple other miscellaneous bones in your shoulder as well.
Okay.
And then for your legs, it would be your leg and your pelvis, essentially.
Okay. So just
So
the limb and the
right,
associated parts.
yeah, but they're just collectively called limb girdles. I don't know why, but yeah. So they were just not as strong, which implies that, or I guess like as large and prominent. So that implies that there's less muscle attached to them. Meaning that they didn't need to have as extreme of forces put on them for doing things like swimming. So
Right. Okay.
they all three of these groups are doing pretty well, doing their thing in the Triassic period, and then right before the end of the Triassic, the first true plesiosaurs show up. And so by this point, they have the full flipper arms. They have not quite super long necks. We'll talk about that in a bit, but they had sort of medium necks, and still relatively small heads with like sharp teeth for catching things like fish, catching things like squid. But fully aquatic by this point. And then, if you have listened to this podcast before, you might know the end Triassic is not a good time because we have a mass extinction.
That's the big one that continues coming up on this podcast.
Yeah, mass extinctions happen a lot. So the end Permian is one that we talk about probably most frequently because that one's the biggest. But this one is only 50 million years after that. So this is around 200 million years ago. And the end Triassic mass extinction kills off all of the other groups that we've mentioned so far. So they kill off the turtle-like Placidots, they kill off the Spikeids 2 animals, the Nothosaurs, and they kill off the Pistosaurs, the ones that are plesiosaur-like but not quite. But the Plesiosaurs, obviously, it's a mass extinction. They struggled a bit. But on the other side, Plesiosaurs made it, and now they had a lot less competition. Because going into the Jurassic, they like explode in their diversity. They do incredibly well in their diversity. And this is when we start to see a lot of the various different shapes. Because the first ones were not all that sort of specialized yet. They were obviously very specialized for being in the water, but they were not specialized within their own group. They were still medium-sized, doing medium things, could eat some fish, could probably eat some shellfish if they wanted. But during the Jurassic, we see the long neck forms, not the longest neck forms, but we see some of the longer neck forms develop, and we see some of the largest of the pliosaurs, the big head ones, sort of show up around this time.
Mm-hmm.
And they really just go absolutely crazy. some of the forms that evolved during this time include Liopleurodon, uh, which you will often see. For example, if you were like me as a kid and watched Walking with Dinosaurs, which was a BBC series of documentaries about, basically having the best dinosaur, like, as scientifically accurate as possible at the time. Obviously, they came out in like 2000, maybe 99, somewhere around there. So
Mhm.
obviously we've learned a lot since then. But one of the pretty much the only thing that rewatching it where I'm like they definitely got that way wrong is with their depiction of the Liopleurodon. Because in reality, Liopleurodon was probably around 20 feet long, which is a really good sized shark. Like that's a big shark, is about 20 feet. Uh in the
That's
documentary,
yeah.
they portray it
That's
as
getting
like 60, 70, maybe 80 feet long, which is just not true.
So it's one of those
So,
things where you didn't have to exaggerate to make your point, and yet you decided to do so anyways.
well, there was some very dubious evidence that from a while ago, like even at the time, a long time ago, where it's like, okay, we just found the skull, right? I think they just had sort of a single skull of Liopleurodon, and they were like, well, if we sort of stretch this out and plug in the body with the same proportions as some other things, yeah, it probably would be like 50 feet long because it's just got an absolutely gigantic head. This ones don't have quite like the 10-foot heads, but probably like 6 foot, at least 5 to 6 foot head.
Hmm.
Um, a comfortable, human laying inside of its mouth. Um, Maybe not comfortable, but you know what I mean. Uh,
Right.
so,
Yeah.
but
Comfortable
but the rest of
relative.
its body just isn't proportionate to that absolutely gargantuan noggin.
I mean, it would be hard to be proportionate in that size.
Right. But so I think what they were actually going off of with like the early sort of reconstructions was a crocodile or an alligator because superficially their skulls do look relatively similar. They're very reinforced. With the pliosaurs, their skulls are very reinforced like crocodilians because they supposedly, if the math is right, that's always an asterisk you have to put on any kind of like biomechanics thing with fossils.
Hmm.
But if the math is works out correctly, these things had absolutely enormous bite forces, like right up there with like well over modern living crocodilians, up there with like T-Rex, with like the strongest bite force of like almost any animal that we've ever had. So they were like,
Oh,
well, it's
I
just
mean,
sort of like a big marine crocodile like thing, right? If its head's this big, crocodiles go on forever past their head. So they're like, this thing must be 80 feet long. Nope.
and it turns out it was not.
It was not. So there were some bigger ones of this variety later, but we'll talk about them when we get there. And that's sort of the big one is that the big sort of specific name that I wanted to mention for the Jurassic was Liopleurodon because I mentioned it earlier. But they
Yeah.
are incredibly
Yeah.
diverse. Over the course of the Jurassic period, dozens and dozens of genera all over the world. Everywhere from Antarctica, North America, Europe, Australia. Actually, I don't know off the top of my head for sure if there's one from the Jurassic of Australia, but they were probably there. We probably just don't have the fossils. Um, Absolutely global animals, and part of the reason is that they are specially adapted, or especially around this time, to being really good cruisers, being able to travel very far distances, presumably over like open ocean, with while spending very little energy. Things that like whales do because they move very quickly. They just don't really look like it because they're so big, but they cruise very quickly and very energy efficiently across the open ocean to get from, fertile spot to fertile spot. And that's what these guys were doing. Then, after the Jurassic, comes the Cretaceous period. And this is when some of like the most extreme examples of plesiosaurs evolve. And here is where we see the like super, super long necked ones, which we usually call Elasmosaurs, which I don't know the etymology of that one, uh, but it is named after a particular genus called Elasmosaurus. Um, and these ones are definitely what most people think of as plesiosaurs. They could be around 50 feet long, with like the neck being at least, if not a little more than half of the total body length, which is just absolutely ridiculous. Like, and we'll talk about it toward the end, but one of the biggest questions is why? What on earth could you be using that for?
A fair question to ask.
And so these things had such weirdly long necks that they could have anywhere, depending on the species, from 32 to 76 bones, like vertebrae in just their neck. For example, or for reference, you have 7.
Can you say that number one more time? So I have 7, and they have.
Depending on the species, anywhere from 32 to 76.
That's a few more. Yeah, that's wow.
It's quite a few more. It's quite a few more. So, these ones still had the really tiny heads, though. Like absolutely tiny, tiny heads. Like probably not any bigger, if any bigger at all. Probably a little smaller than like your head.
So like, imagine all those bones. Wow.
Yeah, but just literally on the end of like a jousting pole from their body.
Jousting. That's a great image in my head now.
Mm-hmm. So these would be animals, for example, if you would like to look them up for your own reference. Like Elasmosaurus, Stixxosaurus is another very popular one. And then we also have the most extreme of the Plesiosaurs around this time as well. That would be animals such as Kronosaurus is frequently cited as the largest of the Plesiosaurs. And these ones got very, very large, anywhere from 30 to 36 feet, which is larger than any predator today in the ocean.
Right, I mean, that's larger than,
with probably the caveat of like sperm whales, because sperm whales are the largest like toothed whales. But
still, 36 feet. That's
huge.
That's an animal.
Yeah, and the head on this thing was at least 7 feet long, potentially up to 9 feet long. So like this would be like a comfortable tent for a Gavin to sleep in. So massive, massive, massive animals. And so these show up sort of in the mid to late Cretaceous. During this time, there were quite a lot of like shallow oceans, which is really good for things that like to eat a lot of fish. But also at this time, there's a lot of like chemical signals and like some things from like just sedimentary rocks to tell that like the oceans in general is a very warm time. The oceans were very fertile. So even out in the open ocean, you could still make a good living as, a predatory animal, which is what allowed these things to become so big. And then, sadly, just as the story of Plesiosaurs kind of began, we have the end Cretaceous mass extinction 66 million years ago. And all
that sounds familiar.
Yeah, we've talked about that quite a few times. You might have heard of it as well.
There was
all Plesiosaurs, among other things.
As we discussed,
as we've talked about. So, yes, Plesiosaurs, cryptozoologists potentially, maybe not Nessie, I don't know. Plesiosaurs die, all of them, at the end of the Cretaceous 66 million years ago. So we talked about their evolution. We talked about some of their features. We should talk about why. Like, what were these things doing with some of these really weird features? And the most obvious one is their neck. So, the ones with the really long necks, there's been a lot of speculation because, again, we have nothing even close to this kind of thing to, compare it to. Potentially, I think the best example, or the most well-supported one, would be like maybe using it to sneak up on schools of fish because fish don't have the best depth perception. So it's like, okay, they see this big body, but they can tell it's kind of far away. But then the head's actually right there and it gets them.
That actually makes some amount of sense.
Right. It makes a little less sense given the context of that their necks were actually quite stiff. So they were not... You will very often see older depictions of them with like their neck like wrapped around something else, like a snake would, like a constrictor. That's not at all how they could move their necks. They were actually quite bad at moving their necks up. They absolutely had to do it somewhat because, you know, being not fish, they had to breathe air. So they had to be able to move it up somewhat to get it above the water to breathe. However, they were okay at moving them sort of downward, almost. Not perfectly straight down from their body, but at kind of a slope down. And then there's evidence for like a fairly decent range of motion, sort of side to side. So they definitely could not do the typical Loch Ness Monster pose of the neck coming basically straight up out of the water. That's definitely not physiologically possible for them.
We might call that fake.
We might call that fake news. So that's
wow.
The
haven't heard that in a little bit.
The best supported hypothesis is for sneaking up on schools of fish like that. There's potentially some weird hydrodynamic stuff with it as well, because
what do you mean,
I personally
stuff?
like helping their swimming efficiency. Like, okay. I know that this is not particularly true, this next thing I'm gonna say, but have you ever heard the myth where it's like if you're falling into like the water and you have something to throw at the water, you should throw it at the water, it'll like break the surface tension or something like that?
Surface tension. Yeah.
Right. So
I've heard that.
That is not true. That was actually on an episode of Mythbusters, fun fact.
Aw.
Yeah, I love Mythbusters. But
big fan.
So there's some potential, and I don't know much about like fluid dynamics and the physics behind it, but there's been some evidence to suggest that like having the head so far out there sort of makes some kind of a wake for the body to travel through to reduce drag on the body while they're swimming, especially these long distances, across, oceans. You want to conserve as much energy as you can.
So it's like a NASCAR kind of thing, like, drafting.
Kind of, but like drafting off of their own head.
Off of yourself, yeah, but right.
That's a really good way to put it.
Right.
So I don't know how strongly that evidence is supported, but it's been thrown around a decent amount in the last couple of years. So that's the head for them. It's the long-necked ones. The short-necked ones with the giant heads, that's pretty self-explanatory. They were eating other large things. They were eating, maybe not like cannibalistic. So, right. They were eating other things as large as themselves. So, if you're eating big things, you need to have a big old head and a big old mouth. So that one is much more straightforward. So moving on to their other weird feature would be their flippers. Because again, sea turtle flippers are the closest thing, but even sea turtles still only have more or less the same number of bones in their flippers that you have in your hand. More or less, there's some variance, but like from finger to finger. But I think like at most that I saw for like bones in an individual finger was maybe like 4 or 5. Definitely not 18.
Right.
And I think even those ones were like very strange individuals. I think most sea turtles actually still have mostly just 3 per finger. So the biggest thing would be, how do they swim? And by that I mean like their actual stroke. Or I think I saw it quite frequently referred to as their gait. Seeming same way that they talk about your own gait. When humans walk, they swing their arms back and forth. That's just that's just what we do. We don't really know why. That's just what we do.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, their gait.
Yeah, so it's like, the biggest question was that did they flap all 4 of them at the same time? Or did they flap them alternating? So when the front ones were down, the back ones would be up, and vice versa. And so that was a really big debate for a long time until our computer technology got a lot better and we were able to like actually mathematically work out what the most efficient answer is, like most efficient gait for them. And it's like, well, they had 140 million years to figure it out. So like whatever was the most efficient is probably what they were doing.
Decent bet.
So what the computers and some actual robotics stuff too, which I think is really neat, what they figured out is that it's not quite either at the same time or alternating. So the front ones would go, and then the back ones would lag behind them a little bit to be in the wake of the front flippers.
Oh wow, okay.
Yeah, so there would be less drag, but they still get just as much like forward propulsion from the back legs as they would the front legs, but there's less drag on the back legs, which was really interesting. That was just a development from like the last probably like 2 years, I think. So that's really new stuff.
Yeah. It's
And
amazing
then
how much
as
more people are able to model now.
oh, it's incredible, and especially like the robotics stuff, because I think the computer model that came up with that answer is a little bit older, maybe like 5 or so years ago. But then the robotic stuff that like they actually built a robot to do that and tested out a whole bunch of swimming configurations, and that did in fact turn out to be the most efficient way to do it with that body plan. So which was really interesting. I really like when different types of science sort of collaborate like that.
Absolutely.
Um,
Combining disciplines, anytime multiple disciplines getting combined where people have to rely on each other's expertise is just,
mhm.
for me, that's just awesome. Whenever that's able to really provide some new answers to questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And so those are the big things I wanted to touch on for this episode. But I do want to talk a little bit about the discovery of these things because the discovery of plesiosaurs, they're one of the first groups where people were like, what is this? We don't have anything even close to this. Obviously, they were named after Ichthyosaurs because they were named in reference to Ichthyosaurs, but they really played a really central role in people being like, okay, animals go extinct because clearly we have nothing even close to this today. So the group Plesiosauria was named pretty early in the history of paleontology. The group itself was named in 1835 by French zoologist. I'm going to flex my French here for a minute.
Please do.
Henri Marie Ducrotay de Blainville.
That was impressive.
Why, thank you.
Why 1835? Is this pre-Bone Wars or are we prime?
Yeah,
Bone
this is like
Wars?
50 years pre-Bone Wars.
Yeah. Okay.
So they have a. Although that person is the one who named them, I've literally never heard his name before doing the research for this episode. uh, the early history of plesiosaurs is much more closely associated, at least today, with a person named Mary Anning, who, if you have ever
Huh.
heard the phrase, she sells seashells by the seashore, that is
Oh,
an
wow.
idiom about Mary Anning.
Really?
Mary Anning was a very prolific fossil collector on sort of the southwestern coast of England, what's now these days referred to as the Jurassic Coast. And so she
Oh,
was
wow.
she made a living, her and her brother, and I believe her father raised them doing this as well, but going out and collecting fossils and selling them to people, including scientists who would then do their research on them. So that's how she made her living.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't believe that it was the first specimen of Plesiosaurus, the actual genus that gives Plesiosauria its name. So Plesiosaurus was named, and then Plesiosauria was named after that. But I believe she found the second ever specimen and a much more complete specimen of Plesiosaurus. And so all of the big movers and shakers in like the London Academy of Science, or the Linnaean Society, or various different zoological societies based out of London and other places in England at the time, would go to her and be like, okay, take us to the fossils, because she was that knowledgeable. And she knew enough. She was never trained, formally in like anatomy or anything. But she knew enough to be like, okay, this one is different than this one. You might want to write that down. So she was like a true like fossil, completely amateur fossil expert. And sadly, because she was a woman, never really got the credit that she was due. I believe she was thanked maybe once or twice in a paper. However, she was likely a part of like hundreds of papers, just giving them information, giving them geologic information, telling them, okay, like I said, this one's different than this one. You've already studied this one, but this one's different. You might want to spend more time on that one. And was never really given her due credit until, much more recently, like in the last, decades, very late into the 1900s.
And better late than never.
Right. And actually, there was a really bad movie made about her recently. I don't actually even know if it came out, because like I saw the trailer of it and I'm like, this is not good. I don't even remember what it's called, to be honest, but if you just Google Mary Anning movie, it'll probably come up. But yeah, so she sadly never got her, recognition in her life. But she is really responsible for a lot of the information that we have about plesiosaurs, because most of the best fossils are from England. And there's many, historical reasons for that. They're the places that had the money, and all the rich people were the ones doing the science at the time, because they were rich and could afford to. So,
of course.
And of course, many colonial reasons for that. But anyway, moving on. That is pretty much all I've got for plesiosaurs. One of my favorite groups, just because they're just so odd. Nothing else. You can argue things like giraffes. Giraffes have long necks, sure, but it's like not in the same way. And also, they live on land. It functions so totally differently when you're in the water and don't have to support your own weight anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And their necks are just so fundamentally so different. Giraffes also only have 7 vertebrae in their neck, the same as you do.
And they have a significantly longer neck, which is
they just make it way longer. But plesiosaurs are just one of the strangest groups of fossil animals, and they're one of my favorites because of that.
Wow.
So that's pretty much all I've got. Do you wanna take us out, Mike?
Sure. Yeah, I wasn't sure if there was anything else, but I'm happy to.
No, that's all I got.
I'm just glad we were able to get an episode or a reference to Charlie the Unicorn in this episode. And of course, this was episode 41 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin, and we will talk to all of you next Wednesday. Take care, everybody.